This video contains audio and visual spoilers for all three titles in the Xenoblade Chronicles franchise, as well as the DLC for Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Torna the Golden Country. The Xenoblade series is certainly one of Nintendo's more mature franchises, among those such as Fire Emblem and Mother, evident by its usage of vulgar language, complex story elements, and perhaps most notably, dozens of deaths. All three of these titles contain numerous casualties of varying importance to the story and varying levels of impact on the players. Many of these deaths are gratifying and many are heart-wrenching, though today I plan on talking about the latter examples. The deaths within these three titles which prove to be more sadness-inducing than anything else. Obviously, there's more to a death than just how the death plays out. While that certainly will play a part in the ranking of this list, there's also the matter of emotional connections between the character and the player, as well as between the character and other characters, and some other factors that'll be brought up in time. With a spoiler warning and now the obligatory "this list is my own opinion" out of the way, let's talk about the saddest deaths in the Xenoblade series. The first casualty on this list also happens to be the first major death from Xenoblade Chronicles 2. At number 10 is the stoic mercenary Vandom. This character originally appeared to be a villain attempting to fight Rex for ownership of the Aegis Pyra. However, it soon became clear that he was only testing the protagonist in order to make sure that he contained the power and skill necessary to protect such a legendary blade. Upon joining forces with the party, Vandom quickly became a very respectable and lovable character. The muscular man was the head of a group of mercenaries focused on the protection of others, and though this undoubtedly kept him busy, Vandom took much time away from his work to focus on aiding Rex and Pyra in their journey to grow into a more skillful duo. Vandom was also very down-to-earth, particularly in his talk of war and its perpetual nature. These traits made me very fond of the character in a very short time. However, it wasn't long before he met his life's end. At the Elethro ruins located atop the Orion Titan, Vandom, along with the rest of the party, pursue Akos and Malos, who are attempting to take Pyra away. It's worth noting that Vandom already had a history with the two villains, who had both killed many of his mercenaries in the past. They eventually, towards the battle's end, also take Vandom's own life. He remained, as was to be expected, dignified until his last breath, with which he uttered to Rex the line, "Remember to fight your war." I never expected to grow attached to a hulking mass of a man like Vandom, but I also never expected to do the same with the short-statured man at number 9, the Emperor of Mor Ardain during the Great Aegis War, Hugo Ardenok. Niall Ardenok, emperor of the same nation during the main game, was a very admirable character. Witnessing such a young and physically compact male hold such a respectable position was very interesting to me. And so when a similar character, Hugo, was introduced in Xenoblade Chronicles 2's prequel, Torna the Golden Country, it was only natural that I quickly began to feel the same way. The primary difference which made Hugo more memorable to me was that, contrary to Niall, this emperor actually joined the protagonist's party, and so he was given many more interactions with other characters, allowing players to feel more connected to him. As was the case with Vandom, in these interactions it became clear that Hugo was a very selfless man as well, sacrificing his safety for the safety of others, and in general making his own needs a secondary priority compared to the needs of those around him. While this trait is evident from the moment Hugo is first encountered, it's displayed most prominently when the Emperor sacrifices his own life to save the life of his close friend Adam Origo. Knowing that such a kind-hearted character had lost his life was already more than enough to hit me hard, but I was also a very big fan of the aforementioned character Adam, and so seeing him break down into tears at the sight of his fallen comrade made me do the same. The game then kicked me while I was down one more time by showing a shot of Hugo's two blades, now returned to their cores, being handed to a low-spirited Ardanian soldier. Though his face can't even be seen, it's clear in this one nameless character's mannerisms that the loss of Emperor Hugo would devastate the entire nation in which he ruled over. The next casualty is that of a character I originally hated on my first playthrough but grew to adore over time. Number 8 is the Tornan antagonist, Mikhail. Yes, I did say that he was an antagonist, but hear me out. I initially hated Mick due to his arrogant personality. That was my sole reason, but somewhere along the line I began to love him. And it was around this point when, despite him being a villain, I was met with sadness at the sight of his demise. As it initially stood, Mikhail's death was impactful due to a few things. Firstly, he was killed in a large-scale duel against a Malthus, a man who despised the world and everything in it. This is meaningful because Mikhail was the same as a Malthus in this scene, also having a strong hatred for the world. Mick was also transformed into a Blade Eater thanks to a presumably grueling process he witnessed the Malthus perform as a child. While everyone who watched the procedure was meant to be disposed of as to not reveal the technology, Mikhail managed to live on. As to why he was dueling with a Malthus in the first place, the strong bonds between Rex's party had reminded him of the people he once loved, which I'll discuss soon. The duality between Mikhail and a Malthus and my love of the former character's personality was enough to make this death sad, but not sad enough for this list. That's where Torna the Golden Country comes in again. This prequel touches greatly upon Mikhail's upbringing. As a child, he was initially very shy, having lost his home to bandits, and soon thereafter his closest friend, Milton, to an attack from Malos, a Malthus's own blade. Thanks to this prequel, it became clear that Mikhail's hatred of the world was gained due to instances of heavy personal loss in his life, specifically loss caused by a Malthus. The fact that Mikhail dies while fighting against the man who stole from him every bit of respect he once had for the world, who stole from him his innocence, his loved ones, and his own will to live, makes his death more than important enough to be on this list. Moving on from Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the first installment in the series has some very serious deaths as well, with number 7 being one of them, Callian Antiqua. Before I talk deeply of Callian, I'd first like to explain in brief detail the backstory of his sister, Melia, as her experiences are a large part of what makes her brother's death as sad as it is. Melia is a half-breed between the Hom and High Entia races. She, despite believing that her brother is more fitting of the throne, was slated to become the new Empress of the High Entia years after the events of the game. However, after witnessing Saurian Antiqua, her father and the current emperor, die in front of her very eyes, she was forced to take up the role much sooner, creating a lot of additional stress for her. Before these events, Melia is also forced to powerlessly watch as her 4 guards, Hogard, Isel, Garen, and Demille, are slain, and after them, she's also met with the death of her own mother as well. On top of all of these losses, the Empress is betrayed and made the target of a failed assassination attempt by fellow High Entia, Tyrea, and Lorithia. It's already quite easily understandable that Melia faces more loss in this game than any other character, however the worst has yet to come. Towards the game's ending, an event unfolds which, simply put, as it would take a very long time to explain in full detail, marks the beginning of the destruction and recreation of the world. The first stage of this process is the eradicating of all life, a task which the High Entia were genetically engineered to perform. As such, when this event occurs, Melia bears witness to her entire race, including her only remaining family member, her brother Callian, turn into mindless, destructive Telethia, knowing that she was bred to escape such a fate and to pioneer a new life for her remaining half-bred High Entia. The stress, horror, and emotions within Melia were evidently at an all-time high here, and the screams of her brother were enough to make the young Empress act irrationally, running into open fire in an attempt to save him, despite her clear inability to do so. Callian's dying monologue, in which he reminds his sister of her duty as the hopes of her people, was one of the most emotional scenes in the entire game for me, but we're not done yet. Lorithia is fought in the game's final stretch, and in that battle, she's seen with the Telethia that was formed from Callian's body, and she even goes so far as to kiss the deceased High Entia's lips as a way to taunt his sister. Lorithia is eventually subdued, resulting in one last spiritual talk between Callian and Melia, giving the latter the hope and determination she needs to continue on. With this final message, this death is made a very melancholic one, and while it's certainly sad, it felt very gratifying to see Melia able to converse with her brother one last time. This next entry might be a bit surprising to some, but at number 6 is the mentor to Shulk and war buddy to Dunban, Dixon. As I've discussed how every aspect of this death makes it so unique and heartbreaking on this channel already, I'll keep this one brief. Yes, Dixon was a villain, perhaps the least respectable in the entire series, but that doesn't change the fact that he was an extremely important role model to the aforementioned protagonists Shulk and Dunban, both of whom had already experienced numerous other personal losses before the death of Dixon. The party was forced to kill this man, and though he was evil, he was still like family to many of them, which is half of what makes his death so sad, with the other half being the dialogue, character interactions during his death, etc., all of which is discussed in the video I can link below. Despite having played and beaten the two main titles numerous times, I only got around to beating Xenoblade Chronicles X relatively recently. Understanding that the game was less story-driven, I never expected this next death to hit as hard as it did. Number 5 is Lao Hwang. If I'm being honest, which I suppose I should be, Lao shouldn't actually be listed here, as the game's post-credits scene reveals that he is still alive. But I'm choosing to include him regardless because that fact actually makes Lao's tale even more sad, and I'll explain why. Xenoblade Chronicles X is set on an uncharted planet under the man-made title Mira. A fraction of Earth's inhabitants, Lao included, crashed here while attempting to pioneer new life following their home planet's destruction. Lao signed up for the expedition known as Project Exodus with his wife and daughter known as Charmaine and Chenchi, hoping that they could all be let on board so that the family could remain intact. However, unbeknownst to Lao at the time, the majority of the project's occupancy was held by rich elites, believing that they were the only part of humanity worth saving. Thus, the remaining spots on board were given only to those with exceptional talents, which would help to improve humanity's chance of survival. Because of this, Lao was granted access to the project while his family was left to die on Earth. The death of his loved ones caused Lao to turn traitorous, joining forces with an alien race, the Ganglion, in order to eradicate the remaining humans. In an encounter with Lao, he begins to talk of his initial beliefs that due to humanity's dire need to survive at any cost, the usual politics and corruption must disappear. He presumed that while not everyone could be saved in such a short period of time, those who could be would be chosen at random, providing a mix of ethnicities, races, religions, and ages. It was the fact that solely wealth and power determined who would be accepted into the program that tipped Lao over the edge, as this made him realize that there was never any hope for his family. Naturally, a realization such as this only made humanity's evident corruption more infuriating to Lao, and it wasn't until Lin, a young girl excelled in the art of mechanical engineering, spoke up to him that he began to have a change of heart. This was because Lin had also lost her family, though at a much younger and more impressionable age. Seeing her hope and perseverance was enough to convince the turncoat to begin regaining faith in humanity. However, the heartbreak from losing his wife and daughter was still enough to render Lao extremely depressed, now wishing nothing more than to die. He does supposedly die after the final battle and acknowledges the beauty of humanity's persistence while doing so, but because of certain technology the humans adapted on Mira, which I won't touch upon, Lao only wakes up in a new mechanical body. The fact that he has to live on while bearing the burden of his lost family while technically not making this a true death is just terrible. These deaths are starting to get more complex, requiring more and more explaining to understand them, and that's not stopping with these next few. At number 4 is the self-proclaimed leader of Mechonis, Egil. Being a Machina, Egil lived a life extending over at least 1,000 years, and thus he was alive during a time where the Bionis and the Mechonis, two massive titans who hosted all life in the first game's world, lived in peace. During this time, Egil was known to be a very kind man, caring for the poor and lesser abled, which caused him to be loved by all of his people. Eventually, however, the time came when Zanza, the god of the Bionis, began a war against the Mechonis, robbing many of Egil's people of their lives. Proclaiming that the screams of his fallen brethren have never once been silenced since that moment, Egil became a merciless machine who aimed for nothing more than to kill Zanza, and to do so, he had to weaken the titan that hosted the god's body. This is what prompted Egil's attacks on the Bionis that take place throughout the game's story. Unwilling to accept any negotiations of peace until he's able to settle the score, Egil appears as the primary antagonist for much of the game. Even upon realizing realizing that the few remaining members of his people would rather accept peace than watch the war wage on, Egil's stubbornness causes him to call them cowards and traitors. This is sad enough already, as Egil truly does have a reasonable excuse for acting how he does, but his passion for his people of old blind him, only causing more suffering. The main protagonists aren't even aware of his motives until the game's final stretch, when they confront him in Agniratha, the Mechonis capital, now a bleak and desolate city. Here they learn of his motives and attempt to make peace, only to be ignored until they confront the man again in the Mechonis core. It's here that Shulk is given the perfect opportunity to kill Egil, but refuses, instead opting to make one last push for peace, which Egil finally accepts, willing to rebuild the harmony the Titans once had. But it's at this point that Zanza is finally reawakened and initiates the destruction and recreation of the world I mentioned earlier. The party flees from the seemingly omnipotent god who, now in control of the Bionis, attempts to strike them out of the sky. Egil, nearly incapacitated from the previous fight, uses the last of his energy to shield the Bionis' attacks and to make one final attack of his own before both he and the entire Titan of Mechonis is destroyed by Zanza's blade. While there aren't many more casualties to cover, and these next few are some of the most interesting in the series as well as the saddest. At number 3 is the man who climbed the world tree, Prater Malthus of Indal. Malthus, like Dixon, is a villain and an extremely dislikable one, but his death is still sad for various reasons, one actually being linked to his dislikable nature. He, like Mikhail, was a man who wished to destroy the world. He awoke an Aegis by the name of Malos and tainted the blade with his own views, causing Malos to despise the world as well. Malthus killed many people, Mikhail being one of them of course, and his blade killed even more. This hatred that fueled him had to have come from somewhere, however. Mikhail's came because of Malthus's, Dixon's came simply out of a desire for power, Lao's came due to the loss of his family, and Egil's came from the loss of his own people. While Malthus's backstory is relatively similar to some of the former characters. He lost his mother to bandits at a very young age, bandits which he later found and stoned to death. While he's never been a very likable character to me in any capacity, it was always interesting to see how someone who hated everything about the world they lived in would act. For instance, despite having no reason to do so, Malthus once healed a man's wounds, only to later find that the same man he just saved had killed his own wife and was about to do the same to his child. Malthus also saved the life of a party member, Zeke von Genbu, simply because the scene of Zeke's blade attempting to carry him to safety reminded him of his own attempt to do the same with his mother. It's clear that Malthus had some semblance of sympathy and compassion for certain inhabitants of the world, but his hatred of others was overpowering, causing his selfish and destructive nature, which becomes more visible as the game progresses. While he has done very few acts of kindness, these were nowhere near enough to redeem the Praetor, but like all of the others on this list, his death was still sad despite what he'd done. One reason for this is the vision Malthus saw right before he had died, a vision of his mother who had been taken from him over a century ago. However, the primary reason is that he was killed by another man who had suffered immeasurable loss, again due to Malthus himself. Malthus was killed by a man who wanted nothing more than to destroy the world just as he did. Or so it seemed. What this man really wanted was nothing more than to die. At number 2 is the Paragon of Torna, Gin. In Malos' words, that man, he'd lost everything. He no longer wanted anything. He didn't even want to live anymore, and despite that, his life was the one thing he hadn't lost because he couldn't. Jin, like a few characters on this list now, was originally a villain whose motives remained unclear for quite a while, but were slowly unveiled. It first became clear that he had lost someone very important to him, presumably due to Mithra sinking the Tornan Titan in the Great Aegis War 100 years prior. However, it's later revealed that she only did so in order to stop Malos, Malthus's blade. His true hatred stemmed from Malthus's, as he was the one who was truly responsible for the death of Jin's important figure, who's also revealed to be Laura, Jin's previous driver. Continuing the quote from earlier, words can be a curse. That curse was what kept him tied down here. This is in response to Laura's final words to Jin before her death, which are as follows. The thought of you forgetting me is like one heart being ripped in two. Jin, after hearing these words, words, chose to eat Laura's heart so that she could live on inside of him, but as a result, Jin could not die out of fear of Laura's final words. He lived on for over 100 years with no purpose other than to bear the depressing weight of those words. He stayed alive for Laura despite knowing that he'd never see her again, while also bearing the memory of Hayes, Milton, Adam, and many others that he'd formed bonds with. As I mentioned, Jin eventually does die while subduing a Malthus, and though he was one of the characters that I was the saddest to see go, it can't be understated how liberated he looked as he faded away, knowing that he had finally found a purpose after living without one for the last century. There's only one character whose death left a greater impact on me than Jin's, and that's because their death, which was a direct result of a Malthus's hatred, caused Jin's own despondent tale. And number one is Jin's driver, Laura. Her death was impactful for all of the obvious reasons that were mentioned in regards to her blade, but is only made more so due to a few minor factors. Firstly, Laura was portrayed in Torna the Golden Country as perhaps the sweetest, most caring character in the series, and her exceptional connection to not only her two blades, Jin and Hayes, but everyone she was around made every second of her screen time so memorable. Laura was so kind-hearted, in fact, that even when given the opportunity to kill Gort, a man who mocked and supposedly abused her dead mother, she showed mercy. Just like Melia, it seems that the kindest characters are the ones who face the most loss, as Laura dealt with the loss of her mother, Milton, Hugo, and eventually Gort before dying herself. All of this is sad, but truly the reason her death tops all of the rest for me is because as soon as I saw that cutscene play during the credits and saw Malthus's army marching towards Jin and Laura, marking the latter's death, I remembered what it did to Jin, how much suffering it caused him, how it cursed him into living a life with no purpose, yet a life that was so desperately in need of being kept alive for Laura's sake. It's the combination of her kind nature and the damage dealt to Jin by her passing that makes Laura's death the saddest in the series. Monolith Soft is a very commendable group of developers that doesn't mess around, and their Xenoblade Chronicles franchise is polished to a perfection in many ways, with story being perhaps the most notable of all. This series is not afraid to kill off characters, loved or hated though they may be. While some casualties, such as those I covered today, bring with them sadness, it can't be denied that all of these deaths make the stories and characters of these titles that much more precious. Which goes to show that deaths, at least in fictional works, can be a very great thing that so many games, specifically many of Nintendo's, choose to ignore. I'm not saying Mario games should go killing off characters left and right, as they do have a younger demographic to appeal to, but there are some titles where characters cheat death so often that it honestly gets somewhat frustrating, and I feel like these games could learn a lot from Xenoblade. But before this video turns into one of me ranting about Nintendo's refusal to kill characters, I should get out of here. Maybe I can write down that topic for another day. But for now, thank you all so much for watching.